Glory Cloud Podcast, Episode 89. Well, stay tuned for some more Kingdom Prologue this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux. Welcome back, Todd.
Thanks, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And, I realized as I was listening to some past episodes, I'm such a jerk. I don't stop and ask you how you're doing. How are you doing, Todd?
Oh, no. You always start with that, so. But I am doing fine and no complaints. So I'm very thankful for being back in the ministry and after my break and being healthy enough to be back in the ministry and talking about the things of the Lord in Genesis. So, yeah, what can be better?
That's right. I always look forward to our discussions every week. Before we jump right into, pages 279 to 291 this week, I will just run through our regular housekeeping, reminding our listeners that we do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There you can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of the episode. There are a couple of free ways that you can support us and help us to get the word out. One of those is to give us a 5-star rating in iTunes. There is a link in the show notes page to take you right there to do that. 5 stars really helps us to stand out as people are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And the other thing that you can do is to subscribe to the podcast. So if you use an app on your smartphone, or if you download it in something like iTunes or Spotify or anything like that, subscribing helps raise our visibility for other people as they are looking for podcasts about the gospel and theology. And finally, if you have the means to support us financially, to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. And any amount that you can give is very much appreciated. It keeps us going. And that way we don't have to worry about scraping up the money to host the audio files. We can just focus on preparing the discussion about Kingdom Prologue. And Todd, we're nearing the end of this book. I can't believe it, but it means we're going to be on to other of Kline's works.
I was thinking that we're moving pretty quickly through. We're going to have to think which one of Kline's works we're going to do.
Well, we have been working through them chronologically, so I think that would make Glory in Our Midst next.
Ooh, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, in any case, we are still in Kingdom Prologue, and like I mentioned, pages 279 to 291. Would you like to remind us about what we talked about last week?
Sure. We're in chapters 10 and 11, and we look back at the descendants from Noah's sons and splitting up into 3, and what Kline pointed out about the sons of Ham, and really focusing on the Tower of Babel and how it was really Ham's sons who were in the land that tried to build that temple and kingdom that would be one false religion centered there and the persecution of God's people and how God intervened. And the Kline really just returns then back to the genealogy. And we're going to spend all our time in the genealogy as he brings about more truths that may not be noticed at first reading in a few difficult verses. And so he starts off by speaking of the repetition of the centrality of Noah's 3 sons in this section. For example, in 9:18, the 3 sons are introduced. And then in 26 and 27, 25 through 27, we have the oracle about the 3 sons. And then in chapter 10, we have the three sons introduced again, verse 1. And Kline is simply pointing out that this is a very central point in the book of Genesis, as it looks back on Noah in the old world, as Noah was a representative of the old world, and then moving into the new post-flood world, as the three sons spread out that way. And so Kline points out that what we have here in this genealogy in chapter 10, and of course it's interrupted by the Tower of Babel in 11, but then returns in verse 10, is a prophetic, and I'm quoting Kline here, a prophetic ethnic glossary for the rest of redemptive history. So everything in these genealogies is looking ahead to what will unfold throughout Israel's life, and then, of course, even in the New Covenant. And again, the very fact that Shem's line is saved for last, Kline brings out that this demonstrates how common grace serves saving grace. So we look at the lines that were the common grace lines outside the covenant community, and Moses, under the inspiration of the Spirit, always puts them first. And he saves the covenant line for the end, just like Shem's descendants start, chapter 11, verse 10. So that's always the central purpose, not what happens at common grace, but what God is doing through his redemptive plan. And that's why Shem's line continues after Babel. And Kline brings up the question why Japheth is listed first and not Ham's descendants. He said it possibly could simply be because of the age, or, there could be other reasons, but he does bring out that Japheth is first, most likely because he may be the oldest. Or it possibly could be what happens in redemptive history, that it's in the Old Testament that Canaan will be cursed, and the fulfillment of the promises to, I'm doing that backwards. It's distant to closer. So it'd be Japheth first because it's most distant, and then moving back. Anyway, that's not a major point. So the sons of Japheth, as Kline summarizes, are the ones that ended up in Asia Minor and southeastern Europe. And he brings out the point that that's exactly where Paul fulfilled the apostolic mission of his journeys. Asia Minor, and then, of course, up through the Roman Empire, Greece and Rome. And so we have a fulfillment of the sons of Japheth coming back into the tent in the New Covenant. That's exactly where Paul is sent. And then Paul even speaks of going further at the end of his life to the coastlands, or where Spain is. And so wherever there are islands and coastlands, those are part of the prophecies in Isaiah. And so in verse 5, chapter 10, from these the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands. And then Isaiah will, of course, say, the people who live on the coast and the islands will see a great light. And so these sons of Japheth are scattered out to the farthest places that would wait to be gathered in the new covenant. And so the sons of Japheth are, in a sense, out of the way. And it brings us to Shem. I'm sorry if I really messed that up, but sometimes it's late. It's late here, and it's backwards in my mind. But you get the point, right?
I do. I don't think it was messed up at all. But it's interesting that really Shem, if I'm understanding what Kline is saying here, Shem is almost the only one that gets considered to be the covenant line, even though the oracle about Japheth was that the tent would be enlarged to bring Japheth in, or his descendants. If I'm understanding Kline correctly, both Japheth and Ham fall under the category of common grace, whereas Shem gets included in saving grace.
Right, especially as we consider that in the Old Testament, the line is the line that will bear the Messiah. And And that is the promise back from Genesis 3, that the children of God will bear a deliverer. And so we're always following this one line, asking the question, from which family, from which line will the Messiah be born? And that's where the Old Testament is going. It keeps dividing, so we'll see where. And that's what makes the genealogies in Matthew and Luke so important, because they trace back to this line. Even all the way back to Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we come to the sons of Ham, as Kline looks back one more time, he just reminds us that these nations at the beginning of chapter 10 were the objects of God's Old Testament judgments. And he just points out 2 points that we didn't bring out last week, and that is the emergence of 2 great world centers, Babel, of course, and Jerusalem. It's the Jebusites mentioned in verse 16, we know from Old Testament history, is where they lived in what would become Jerusalem. And so already in chapter 10, we're introduced to this conflict, this enmity between the 2 great powers, man's power centered in Babel and God's power centered in Jerusalem. So again, Kline's point is we're simply being introduced in a seed form of how the whole Testament will unfold. And even in that sense, the boundaries of Canaan are introduced, as we're told about the borders of Canaan. And from the north to the south, if you follow along from, verses 4, 5 to 10, after 5 to 6 to 10. And we see that the 2 representative symbols then of this great land, Canaan and Babel, will fulfill the enmity in the Old Testament, at least of Genesis 3, that the children of God and the children of Satan will be centered in these 2 great places, Jerusalem and more broadly Canaan, when God's people are there, and then Babel, representing those who would persecute God's people. And so if you're going to preach through this, you really are preaching redemptive history in its seed form. And you can look ahead and see how all this will play out. But of course, if you were a Jew living in the time of the Old Testament later on, you would see all this because a lot of it had already happened by the time you're reading this or hearing this. And so you're already seeing the beginning of everything God would do before it happened. In that sense, even these genealogies would be a means of grace to them. As these mighty nations are being formed, we have a promise in Genesis 3 and Genesis 9 of what God would do. And then history would show how God did it. And so even a simple verse of the existence of these at the beginning would be a means of grace, of encouragement to them, of God's power and his promise. And that's really something to think that these genealogies are means of graces if we understand them correctly.
Right. It's so easy to read through them and just feel like you have to slog through a bunch of names and things like that. But when you understand how they're serving God's redemptive purpose, they take on a lot more significance.
Yes, and if I was advising young men preaching through this, I would say you don't necessarily have to read all of the names and get bogged down with all of the geography, but you could certainly pick out certain names in redemptive history, and you would have a great sermon, a biblical theological sermon from the genealogy, and then apply it right to God's continuing promise to his people of how much we can trust him now and for the future because of his past fulfillment of his promises here. So that brings us to the sons of Shem, and we're moving over to chapter 11, verse 10. And we have that Shem becomes the father of the Eberites, and that really becomes the Hebrews. Over time, it just changed a little bit. And so we see that God's divine choice will be choosing the Eberites, Shem's son, verse 15, after he got Eber. And so Eber's son was Peleg, and Peleg would be the one chosen to continue the covenant line. Notice how Eber's other son will disappear pretty quickly, Joktan. So Genesis 10 only follows Joktan through his immediate sons and then stops. And then all the focus is on Peleg. So we see that even among the children of Shem, there's this divine, sovereign choice of a covenant line. Not based on works, but based on God's sovereignty that separates the peoples. So as we're following from whom Christ will be born, now we know it will be a son, a descendant of Peleg. And so we have that interesting phrase in verse 25. It says, not 25, verse, now I lost it again. Oh, I'm sorry, it is 25, but it's 10:25. I'm looking at 11.
Oh.
To Eber was born two sons, the name of the one Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. That raises a lot of questions. What exactly does that mean? How is the earth divided? And so Kline is guessing, he's speculating that what this refers to is the actual division in the family from the two sons. That's when the covenant line was separated among the sons of Shem from the rest. He said it's possible that you could use this as a topographical reference, that in those days the earth was also, that area was divided by irrigation canals. So it's possible it's a reference that the Hebrews would be the farmers. They would be the one that used the canals for farming. And so Kline leans toward the idea of family division, because as soon as it does divide, you follow the covenant community and it's divided from the rest. But that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Appearing out of nowhere, that now the earth is divided.
Right.
We're going to look at another tough verse a little bit later, but there's a few of them here. And so as we go to 10:21, we see, and children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. And it continues on there. So it was Abraham's family that would bear God's name, the sons of Shem. And of course, Shem means name. And so Abraham's family now, Peleg's descendant, would be chosen to bear God's name, to receive the promised kingdom, and to execute Noah's curse on Canaan. And that's an interesting point he brings out. Because in Genesis 14, Abraham is identified as a Hebrew when he is fighting the other nations in protection of the covenant community. And that's the first time he's spoken of as a Hebrew. So Kline is relating that the one that would bear God's name, Abraham's family and Abraham, symbolizes the one who fights the battle, the forces of evil. So we see in the flood, God defeats the waters, the evil flood waters for his people. And then he defeats the Egyptians, of course, and saves his people from them. And of course, he defeats the Canaanites. And so Kline is pointing out that one of the aspects of bearing God's name in the Old Testament is to execute God's curse on his enemies. And so, in a sense, we have God doing that himself to the enemies of Noah, to the enemies of Israel. And then Abraham does it as he's identified as a Hebrew. And so Kline points out that there's a sense that we will do that, of course, in final judgment. That in some sense we will judge the angels, as it says.
Right.
And so it sort of stretches what we usually think of what it means to bear God's name. We don't usually think of ourselves as believers as bearing God's name as also being a part of that aspect of his lordship. And of course, we don't do that in this life, but Kline points out we will do that at the judgment. So that's one of those, I haven't really thought much of that. And that's pretty heavy, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, at least I'm so conditioned to think of suffering being the mode of just the way life goes, that it's hard to fathom that, being in battle mode will be part of what it means to be God's people, at some point in the future.
Yes. And from a pastoral perspective, we also often wonder about our family members that don't know the Lord, and how will we enjoy heaven knowing they're not there?
Right.
Those type of questions. And we just have to look ahead in faith and see that, and I think Spurgeon said this, that even with his own children, he will say amen at judgment, whatever God does. We will see things from a totally different perspective. We will be on God's side, and it will all make sense. And there will be no more tears, even for what we would think of as former family members, because there are no earthly families in heaven. Mm-hmm. The family will be the church. And so as difficult it is to imagine that type of difference, that's what the Lord says will happen. So we won't be in a situation where we'll be in heaven and then be sad about who's not there.
Right.
Now, Kline brings out an important warning here, and the warning is not to confuse the redemptive typological cleansing of the Holy Land from without to any type of a political and cultural common grace cleansing we might try to do from within.
Right.
And so, as agents of God's judgment in the Old Testament, the Israelites, they declared holy war on the Canaanites. And because this was God's holy land, they were to be cleansed out, thrown out, destroyed, so the land could belong to God. And Kline points out this was not a political or cultural common grace activity where Christians from within begin to take over the government or influence culture to the point where the Canaanites would be more under God's law. This was a cleansing. And it was a picture of final judgment, because Canaan is a picture of the new heavens and earth. That's what it is a type of.
Right.
So it is a prostitution of the gospel, to use Kline's word, to somehow use what the Israelites did in the nation as some type of a paradigm for what we do as the church through cultural or political means. There is no connection between what they did and anything we do in this life in the unbelieving world. And to bring the truth of what is happening here as a picture of final judgment into some sort of cultural Christianizing of the world is then to really confuse the gospel and how this pictures what the gospel ultimately does at the last day.
Absolutely. And I mean, to tie it in with what we were just talking about a minute ago, the only way we can see ourselves in what Israel was doing in Canaan is when we consider what will happen when Jesus returns. And like you were just saying, it may be difficult to conceive of ourselves in that warrior mode, given our limited earthly perspective right now. But like you said, it will make sense then. We will be on God's side. And I mean, allegiances will just be very plain and clear at that point. But I mean, that's where the connections could be made. When we try to evaluate what Israel did in Canaan according to our our current common grace situation, it looks like genocide. Right. And so if we've got listeners that have just joined us recently, Lee and I actually did an episode. I'll link to it in the show notes, but we considered Richard Dawkins and his objection to, religion in general, but he was taking aim at Christianity and Judaism, I suppose, because of what he was judging to be genocide in Israel's conquest of Canaan. And that can be a real stumbling block for unbelievers who try to evaluate that according to common grace principles that we live under today. But what Kline is saying is that there was nothing common grace about what Israel was doing. It was typological, and they were bringing about typological judgment on the very physical, geographical area that God had staked out as his kingdom on earth. It had to be cleansed for his kingdom.
Exactly. And as Kline points out here, that the Israelites were to establish the holy kingdom of God.
Right.
Not sort of a mix. And so you hear a lot of theonomists and others today, they use such violent and warlike language as what the church should be doing in defeating the human enemies. And it's really a wrong view of the promises and when God will defeat his enemies, and that we're in a time of mission. Our goal is not to defeat them, but to reach them with the gospel. And to get that confused really messes up everything, doesn't it?
It really does. I don't know if there's any better way to put it than what Kline said. I mean, it is a prostitution of the gospel to think that you're going to pick up a weapon and accomplish God's purposes that way.
Right. And even if they don't say weapon, the idea is still Christian victory in this age over the forces of evil in a political and cultural sense.
Sure.
Where we rule and we make the decisions and establish things. And even that idea is, you just can't get that from what God told the Israelites to do. I mean, you're going to have to look elsewhere, but not look to Israel as your example.
Right.
And then Kline points out that this even prepares for the rise of the Davidic monarchy, because David will picture Christ as the royal king of God's people. So you have the cleansing of a holy land, but a land needs a king.
Right.
And so David will picture that king ruling and defeating the enemies of God's people, protecting them. And that brings us to Genesis 11. That's where I went earlier by mistake, but now we're actually there. Genesis 11:10. And as we continue on with Shem's descendants, we see that God preserves the covenant community in spite of Babel. So you have Genesis 11, where the Tower of Babel, and as that's going on in one area, and that's threatening, if it continues, if that program would have continued, it would have threatened God's people. Here we have, because of what happened in Genesis 11, a continuous thread of the line, the covenant line, that was not interrupted by the plans of Babel. So it's good to put these two together and see God's protection of his people as we return to Shem's descendants. And again, Kline points out that behind this, Japheth's line is in the background. One day they will join this line of Shem. And then he points out that not all of Shem's line are believers. And he pointed that out before Noah, that simply being in the covenant community did not mean you were of the elect. For example, even when we get to Abraham, we learned later that in Joshua that he was an idol worshiper. He was not a believer. He was not raised. He did not believe the promises, if he even heard them by that time. And it doesn't even mean that all those outside are necessarily unbelievers, because Melchizedek was outside the covenant line, and yet we learned he was a believer. But normally the believers were in Shem and then Peleg's line, of course, and the unbelievers outside of it. Kline also points out the continuity between the line here and the genealogies back in Genesis 5. We see in 4 and 5, we see that the line is part of common grace and part of saving grace. So they're still part of the common grace world. They're not separated into separate cities. So whatever Cain built out there and all his children building cities, Shem's line would still be part of that. And so that they would share the cultural mandate with the unbelievers as they continue to fill the earth and subdue it. At the same time, you have the family structure of the covenant community that continues on from before. We talked about until Israel, the family is the central structure of the covenant community of the Old Testament church. That continues on, and they continue as an altar community. And so we saw, even way back in Genesis 4, the covenant community is established as an altar community. The altar was the center of their religion. And of course, with Noah, he builds an altar, the beginning of this line. And then Abraham is building altars when we come to his life. And so we have to assume that the altar community continued all these, who knows, hundreds, thousands of years as a place out in the wilderness somewhere where the church gathered. And as the big structures of the world were being built, these little stone altars would be the place where God would meet and strengthen his covenant community. So if you want to look for some Old Testament pattern to pattern ourselves after, we have to go here, or we go not when the Israelites are defeating the enemies, but when God's people lived in the same common grace situation as the unbelievers. Or you can go to when God's people were exiled to Babylon. That's the paradigm for us.
Right.
Not defeating our enemies here and controlling culture. So Kline also points out another continuity, that the sons of Shem would be the source of prophetic revelation. They would be the ones that continue to preach to the world. And he even brings out the very fact that we know what happened with Babel was probably revealed to the sons of Shem. How would we know from God's perspective what happened? Unless prophetically that was revealed. And so the prophets, those who acted as prophets, would be part of this covenant line. And of course, Abraham does at some level act as a prophet, as the divine counsel of what God would do is revealed to Abraham, thinking specifically of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
And so pre-flood and post-flood, everything in many ways looks the same, which goes back to remind us that the flood really did nothing to change the basic truths of what were happening in the world. It served as a picture, but things went pretty back to normal after the flood.
Yep, the fall is still a reality, isn't it?
Yeah, and everything else that the fall affected, and the two lines, and it's all continuing on.
Yep.
So one thing we get from this is Noah was not the Messiah, was he?
No. Even if every woman in the covenant line is asking herself as she bears a son, is this the one? Those sons seem to also be realizing, nope, I'm not the one.
Exactly. And I think Kline points out somewhere that we should expect, as life goes on, a heightening and increasing of the reality of the curse.
Oh.
So maybe even, we see people living less as far as the length of days of their lives. We see, he suspects that maybe even, the birth pangs of pregnancy got even more difficult as time went on. I mean, even from a physical standpoint, it would take time for all the diseases and things to work its way through the generations.
Sure.
That people would live less. And that brings us to what Kline calls a Mosaic postscript on page 289. Because there are these 3 verses that are looking back on these times that are very difficult to understand. It's Deuteronomy 32:7-9, which says, "Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you. Your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is allotted heritage." So these verses refer back to the separations that were happening in our genealogies here. And so the question is, what does this mean? He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. What does that mean, according to the number of them? So we see that God did order the nations for Israel's benefit. That what God was doing with the sons of Ham and the sons of Japheth, he was doing for the benefit of his people. Because the Lord's portion here is listed only as his people. Notice how he gave to the nations their inheritance, but the Lord's portion is his people. So you have that personal allegiance from God to the covenant community and then back to God. That these other nations are not called the Lord's portion. Now, in a very general sense, the Lord was the king of all. But in a very special sense, he was the ruler and protector of his people. So this in itself is a prophetic indictment of those outside of his saving grace. Now that brings us to that sentence, that phrase, according to the number of the sons of God. Now the King James has, according to the number of the children of Israel, which in the original Hebrew, that's what it is. The Masoretic text is Israel. Now in the Septuagint it says, according to the number of the angels of God.
Oh, interesting.
Which shows that the translators didn't know what to do with this.
Right.
Because even if you use the original, according to the number of the children of Israel, what does that mean? And so Kline gives some possibilities, as Meredith always did. He says it's possible what it means is God assigned if you take it not of Israel but as God assigned a son of God, here would be more a demon, to rule over each of these nations. In other words, God himself would rule over Israel, but he's abandoning the nations to his direct rule in the sense of his saving rule to the demons, while his people would worship him.
Okay.
And so one translation would be God assigned a son of God according to the number of the sons of God. He fixed the borders according to them. So he would give each one demon. Another possibility is that each nation had one human ruler, and now he's hearkening back to Genesis 6, where human rulers were called sons of the gods.
Okay.
So that's sort of a way to say, while he would raise up David to rule over his people, he would give human secular or tyrants to rule over the nations, which, of course, historically is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of alluding again to Psalm 82, which calls the human judges of the world gods.
Right.
Because they themselves claim to be gods. Of course, it's a mockery of them. But And then in distinction, God himself would be the king over Israel, and then his servant David. And so you can choose one of those. Kline doesn't lean too strongly between one and the other. There may be even another one that we haven't considered, but it's one of those verses you're reading. You say, what? What does that mean? Kline simply says the bigger point in all this, however you interpret that phrase, is that Israel is being singled out as God's holy covenant community. And he would treat his people and rule over his people much differently than these other nations. And if anything else, it reminds us that the Lord Jesus rules his church uniquely by his word and spirit, his saving love. And he is a ruler over the kings of the earth. It's a completely distinct way he rules over how he rules us.
Mm-hmm.
He rules us in a very loving, personal sense. He rules the world by his providence. Not that he doesn't use his providence with his church, but it's much more personal and it's inward. He rules inside us by his spirit, and then the word is given to the covenant community. So that is being seen here. But any thoughts on how this strange verse that even Kline is admitting it's difficult? I always figure if Kline doesn't understand it, I'm pretty safe not understanding it.
Yeah. I guess I don't have anything profound to offer. I mean, it is a difficult choice, and gosh, if the Greek translators of the Hebrew couldn't really nail it down either, I guess I'm in good company.
Yeah, it's interesting that they were the Jews still in the Old Testament time, that they're reading this. And they're saying, according to the number of the children of Israel, we have no idea what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And so they came up with the closest one. Of course, El still being in the word Israel and sons of God. So Kline doesn't want you to lose the bigger picture of Israel being singled out over what this verse might mean. But, of course, that's bringing us all. We're really bordering now on Abraham.
Right. I mean, the stage has definitely been set for his entrance, hasn't it?
Yes, and once we get to the life of Abraham, now we can bring out things as Abraham walks with God that are... There are a lot of lessons in Abraham's life that'll be fun to go through. I remember preaching through Abraham's life, and there's so much there we can talk about, and a little beyond what Kline brings out, but really, because we can relate to Abraham as, in a way, even more than Israel as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
There is so much to learn about his walk with God and weaknesses and faith and the typology throughout these portions leading us to the New Testament. But that will be a good place for us to stop and look forward to.
Definitely. I mean, I don't want to steal thunder from future episodes, but just to relate it to what we've talked about in this episode, I mean, not only does someone like the Apostle Paul spend a lot of time making connections between our justification and Abraham's justification, but even what we were talking about in terms of the altar community. I mean, you want to look at, if you want to look at the Old Testament and ask the question, how should we be relating to the unbelieving world around us? Actually, Abraham's life and times would be a better place to look than Israel, who actually descended from Abraham.
Yes, and like you said, there are theological truths that Paul brings out about what justification is, as well as truths about sanctification and what it means to walk by faith. As Hebrews points out, Abraham walked by faith, but we'll see, not always, right?
Right. And I mean, that can be encouraging too, when we realize that even these people who, as you've pointed out in the past, do function in some sense as an example for us, are not perfect. And so it's not that we shouldn't be striving to grow in our sanctification, but when we fail, we realize that we're still in good company.
Yes. Yes, and the Bible does not shy away from bringing out all their sins and weaknesses for that reason.
Exactly. Well, that's probably a good place to pause then.
Sure.
Okay. Well, we'd really love to hear what you think about this episode. So you can always email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux. And you can also continue the discussion at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast and they can get you added. And other than that, we will see you next week in episode 89. Episode 90.